What if the only thing separating you from chaos is a system you rarely think about? Imagine a world with no law, no police, no courts, no authority, only fear, suspicion, and the instinct to survive. Thomas Hobbes lived through civil war and concluded that this nightmare is not fantasy. It is the natural condition of humanity when power disappears. His ideas force us to confront an uncomfortable question. Is freedom worth the risk of returning to violence? Thomas Hobbes was born on April 5, 1588, in the small English town of Westport near Malmesbury, at a moment of national fear. That same year, the Spanish Armada threatened England with invasion. Hobbes would later remark that fear and he were born twins. The statement was not merely poetic. Fear, insecurity, and the constant awareness of violence would shape both his life and his philosophy. Few thinkers were as deeply marked by political chaos as Hobbes, and few produced a vision of society so stark, so unsettling, and yet so enduring. His father, a clergyman of modest education, abandoned the family after a conflict with another priest, leaving Hobbes to be raised primarily by his uncle. From an early age, Hobbes demonstrated unusual intellectual ability. He learned to read and write at an early age and showed a talent for classical languages. By his teenage years, he had translated Greek tragedies into Latin verse. Education provided him an escape from instability and a pathway into the world of ideas. Hobbes entered Magdalen Hall at Oxford University at age 14. The curriculum remained rooted in medieval scholasticism, emphasizing Aristotle and traditional logic. Hobbes later criticized this education as rigid and outdated. He believed it relied too heavily on authority rather than observation and reasoning grounded in real human experience. Even during his student years, he felt dissatisfied with inherited systems that seemed detached from the realities of political life. After completing his degree, Hobbes became tutor to William Cavendish, the son of a powerful aristocratic family. This position would define much of his life. Serving the Cavendish family not only provided financial stability, but also introduced him to Europe's intellectual circles. Through travel across France and Italy, Hobbes encountered the new scientific revolution transforming thought. He met thinkers influenced by Galileo and witnessed firsthand the power of mathematical reasoning applied to nature. The scientific developments of the 17th century profoundly shaped Hobbes's philosophical method. He became convinced that human society could be understood in the same mechanistic way that scientists explain physical motion. Just as objects move according to predictable laws, human beings, he believed, act according to basic psychological forces. Chief among these forces were desire and fear. England during Hobbes's adulthood descended into political crisis. Tensions between King Charles I and Parliament escalated into civil war in the 1640s. The conflict shattered assumptions about divine monarchy and social stability. Hobbes, who feared chaos above all else, viewed civil war as the ultimate nightmare, a collapse of order that revealed humanity's violent potential. The execution of the king in 1649 confirmed for him how fragile political systems truly were. It was during this period of exile in France, surrounded by the instability of revolution, that Hobbes composed his most famous work, Leviathan, published in 1651. The book remains one of the most powerful and controversial works in political philosophy. Its central claim was direct and unsettling. Human beings, when left without strong authority, fall into a condition of conflict. In what Hobbes called the state of nature, there is no government, no law, and no overarching power to enforce order. In such a state, life becomes, in his famous phrase, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Hobbes did not claim that humans are evil by nature. Rather, he argued that they are fundamentally equal in vulnerability and driven by self-preservation. Because resources are limited and individuals desire security and power, competition inevitably arises. Without a common authority to enforce agreements, mistrust grows. Even peaceful individuals must remain ready to defend themselves. creating a cycle of suspicion and preemptive violence. From this bleak analysis emerged Hobbes's solution. To escape the state of nature, individuals collectively agree to surrender certain freedoms to a sovereign authority capable of maintaining peace. This agreement forms what he called the social contract. Unlike later thinkers who emphasized liberty, Hobbes prioritized security. The sovereign, whether monarch or assembly, must possess absolute power to prevent society from collapsing back into war. Leviathan shocked readers by defending strong, centralized authority at a time when many sought to limit royal power. Hobbes argued that rebellion against sovereign authority risked returning society to chaos. For him, peace was the highest political good. Even imperfect government was preferable to civil war. Yet Hobbes's philosophy was more complex than simple defense of monarchy. He grounded political authority not in divine right, but in rational agreement among individuals seeking survival. Authority arose from consent, not from God's decree. This move secularized political theory, shifting its foundation from theology to human psychology. Beyond politics, Hobbes developed a comprehensive materialist philosophy. He believed that reality consists entirely of matter and motion. Human thought, sensation, and emotion arise from physical processes within the body. Even imagination and reasoning follow mechanical principles. This radical materialism challenged religious doctrines about the soul and spiritual substance, provoking accusations of atheism. Hobbes's view of religion itself was shaped by his desire for stability. He argued that religious conflict often fueled political unrest. Therefore, interpretation of Scripture should remain under sovereign control to prevent division. This stance intensified controversy surrounding his work, as many feared it subordinated faith to political power. Despite criticism, Hobbes lived a long life, continuing to write and defend his ideas well into old age. He witnessed the restoration of the monarchy under Charles II, whom he had once tutored in exile. Though often attacked by critics, Hobbes retained royal protection that shielded him from serious punishment. Thomas Hobbes died in 1679 at the age of 91, leaving behind a political philosophy forged in fear of disorder and grounded in a mechanistic understanding of human nature. His vision of the state as an artificial construction created to contain human conflict remains foundational in modern political thought. By confronting humanity's capacity for violence without illusion, Hobbes forced later philosophers to respond. Some rejected his pessimism, others modified his social contract theory, but none could ignore the stark clarity with which he described the fragile boundary between order and chaos. As Leviathan began circulating across England and the continent, Thomas Hobbes quickly discovered that publishing bold ideas about power and religion carried consequences. The book was not merely controversial. It unsettled nearly every faction. Royalists were uneasy because Hobbes grounded political authority not in divine right, but in human agreement. Parliamentarians distrusted him because he defended strong, centralized sovereignty. Clergy were alarmed by his materialism and his insistence that religious authority ultimately fell under civil power. Hobbes had managed to disturb monarchists, republicans, and theologians at the same time. The core of the controversy lay in the structure of Leviathan itself. Hobbes divided the work into 4 parts, beginning with an analysis of human nature. He approached humanity not as a theologian describing sin or virtue, but as a scientist describing motion. Every human action, he argued, arises from basic drives. People seek pleasure and avoid pain. They pursue what they desire and withdraw from what threatens them. From these simple movements emerge complex emotions such as hope, fear, ambition, pride, and jealousy. Fear held special importance in Hobbes's psychology. It was not cowardice, but rational awareness of vulnerability. Human beings are physically and mentally similar enough that no one can guarantee permanent dominance over others. Even the strongest can be killed while sleeping. This equality of vulnerability creates constant insecurity. Because individuals cannot rely on goodwill alone, They compete for power to protect themselves. Thus, the struggle for security becomes a permanent feature of human life. Hobbes's description of the state of nature was not intended as a historical account of early humanity. It functioned as a thought experiment. He asked readers to imagine society without government, without enforceable laws, without courts or police. In such a condition, promises would carry no guarantee. Agreements would dissolve whenever breaking them seemed advantageous. Industry would disappear because no one could trust that their labor would remain theirs. Culture, trade, and learning would collapse without safety. From this bleak scenario, Hobbes constructed the logic of the social contract. Individuals, guided by reason, recognize that cooperation under authority provides greater security than constant war. They therefore agree to authorize a sovereign power capable of enforcing peace. Importantly, the contract is not between ruler and people. It is among individuals themselves, who collectively authorize the sovereign to act on their behalf. Once established, this authority must be undivided and absolute, because divided power invites conflict. Hobbes did not insist that sovereignty belong exclusively to a monarch. It could exist in an assembly or other governing body. However, he believed monarchy functioned most effectively because it avoided internal division. Stability, not participation, remained his primary political value. Liberty, in his system, meant freedom from interference where law was silent, not the right to challenge authority at will. Critics accused Hobbes of endorsing tyranny. He responded that any government, even harsh rule, remained preferable to civil war. The memory of England's violent conflict shaped this conviction. He had witnessed neighbors turn against neighbors, religious factions persecute each other, and political institutions collapse into bloodshed. For Hobbes, the worst government was still better than the anarchy he feared above all else. His materialist philosophy further intensified opposition. Hobbes denied the existence of immaterial substances. Thoughts, sensations, and imagination were motions within the body caused by external objects. When light strikes the eye or sound vibrates the ear, mechanical processes produce perception. Memory is decaying sense. Imagination is weakened sensation. Even reasoning becomes a form of calculation, adding and subtracting ideas like numbers. This mechanistic view reduced the soul to bodily motion, challenging deeply rooted religious doctrines. Hobbes did not openly deny God's existence, but he interpreted Scripture in ways that minimized supernatural explanation. Miracles, prophecy, and spiritual authority required sovereign oversight to prevent manipulation. He feared that unchecked religious interpretation could destabilize political order, as it had during the Civil Wars. Despite accusations of atheism, Hobbes insisted that belief in God was compatible with his system. However, religion must not undermine civil peace. The sovereign alone held authority to interpret Scripture publicly. Private belief could remain internal, but public doctrine required political unity. This argument reflected his conviction that divided authority inevitably leads to violence. In the decades following Leviathan's publication, Hobbes became both famous and isolated. Intellectual circles debated his ideas intensely. Some philosophers admired his clarity and systematic reasoning, even if they rejected his conclusions. Others viewed him as morally dangerous. Universities in England publicly condemned his writings, and proposals emerged to prosecute him for heresy. Only royal protection prevented serious punishment. During the Restoration period under Charles II, Hobbes enjoyed a degree of favor because of past association with the king. Yet he remained cautious. He turned increasingly toward less politically explosive subjects such as geometry and classical translation. Even so, he continued defending his philosophical positions in letters and smaller works, clarifying misunderstandings and responding to critics. Hobbes's later years were marked by intellectual resilience. Well into his 80s, he composed poetry, translated Homer's Iliad and Odyssey into English verse, and engaged in debates about mathematics. His mind remained active despite physical aging. Few philosophers maintained such productivity across so many decades. As his reputation spread across Europe, Hobbes's ideas influenced thinkers who would later modify or challenge him. His formulation of the social contract became foundational, even for those who rejected absolute sovereignty. Later philosophers would adopt his contract theory, but emphasized natural rights and limited government instead of centralized authority. In this way, even opposition to Hobbes depended upon the framework he created. Thomas Hobbes forced political philosophy to confront uncomfortable truths about fear, power, and human vulnerability. By stripping away romantic illusions about natural harmony, he built a system grounded in psychological realism. His work compelled future generations to ask whether order requires authority, whether liberty can exist without security, and how fragile the boundary remains between civilization and chaos. The questions he raised would continue echoing long after his own turbulent century had passed. As Thomas Hobbes entered the later decades of his life, his intellectual battles did not fade, but instead deepened in intensity. By now, Leviathan had secured his place as one of the most provocative thinkers in Europe. He was admired for his clarity and systematic reasoning, yet feared for the implications of his ideas. In coffee houses, universities, and private correspondence, debates over Hobbes became unavoidable. His name itself began to symbolize a certain uncompromising realism about power and human nature. One of the most persistent criticisms centered on his view of morality. If human beings are driven primarily by desire and fear, critics asked, what becomes of virtue? Hobbes answered by redefining morality within the framework of social agreement. In The State of Nature, he argued, there is no justice or injustice because there is no common authority to enforce rules. Concepts like right and wrong emerge only after individuals establish laws under a sovereign power. Morality is not an eternal code floating above society, but a structure created to secure peace. This claim disturbed many religious thinkers who believe morality must be grounded in divine command. Hobbes did not deny that religion could influence moral behavior, but he insisted that civil law ultimately determines what is just within society. Without enforcement, moral rules collapse into private opinion. Justice, therefore, depends on political order. In this sense, Hobbes fused ethics and politics into a single system built upon stability. At the same time, he introduced what he called the laws of nature, rational principles that guide individuals toward peace. These laws are discovered through reason rather than revelation. The first law urges individuals to seek peace when possible. The second encourages them to lay down certain rights in exchange for security. The third requires keeping agreements once made. These principles are rational strategies for survival, not moral commandments in a theological sense. They operate as practical steps toward escaping mutual destruction. Hobbes's analysis of freedom also challenged traditional views. He rejected the idea that freedom means absence of all restraint. For him, freedom simply meant the absence of physical obstacles to motion. A person is free when not physically prevented from acting according to their will. This definition removed metaphysical speculation about free will and focused on observable conditions. Political liberty therefore exists where laws do not forbid action, not where individuals possess unlimited choice. Such arguments gave Hobbes's philosophy a striking consistency. Everything flowed from his mechanistic understanding of nature. Human beings were bodies in motion, governed by appetites and aversions. Society was an artificial machine constructed to manage those motions. Sovereignty functioned as the central power that maintained equilibrium. Even language and reasoning operated as tools within this larger mechanism. Yet Hobbes's thought was not entirely devoid of subtlety or nuance. He acknowledged that sovereign power must still aim at the preservation of its subjects. If a ruler directly threatens an individual's life, that individual retains the natural right to self-preservation. In this limited sense, resistance becomes rational. However, Hobbes remained cautious about encouraging rebellion. fearing it would reopen the door to chaos. During these years, intellectual opposition intensified within England's universities. Oxford scholars formally condemned Leviathan as dangerous and heretical. Some accused Hobbes of undermining religion by reducing scripture to political instrument. Others objected to his materialism, which left no room for immaterial souls or spiritual substance. The climate grew tense enough that Parliament considered investigating his writings for atheism. Hobbes responded not with retreat, but with further clarification. He composed additional works defending his philosophy, including De Corpore and De Homine, which expanded his materialist system into logic, physics, and human psychology. In these writings, he attempted to construct a complete philosophical framework beginning with geometry and extending through ethics and politics. His ambition was enormous. He sought nothing less than a unified science of reality. Despite controversy, Hobbes retained personal relationships with influential figures, including members of the royal court. His long association with the Cavendish family continued to provide protection and patronage. Even critics sometimes admitted respect for his intellectual rigor. Few could deny the power of his reasoning, even when rejecting his conclusions. As he aged, Hobbes increasingly turned toward classical literature, perhaps seeking distance from political turbulence. His translations of Homer revealed a different dimension of his mind, one capable of poetic expression alongside philosophical analysis. Yet, even in translation, his worldview remained visible. He admired strength, order, and clarity of structure, qualities reflected both in epic poetry and in his political theory. By his late 80s, Hobbes had lived through extraordinary upheaval. Monarchy, civil war, republic, restoration. He had seen the collapse of traditional authority and the violence that followed. His philosophy was not abstract speculation detached from reality. It was shaped by lived experience of instability and bloodshed. Fear, which he once described as his twin at birth, remained central not because he celebrated it, but because he recognized its power in shaping human behavior. Thomas Hobbes forced political thought to confront the uncomfortable possibility that civilization rests on fragile foundations. Remove authority, he warned, and beneath the surface lies competition, mistrust, and potential violence. His stark realism would influence generations of thinkers who grappled with the tension between security and freedom. As the 17th century moved toward its close, Hobbes stood as a solitary figure, controversial yet undeniably foundational. Whether praised or condemned, his ideas could not be ignored. The questions he raised about authority, fear, and the nature of human cooperation would echo long beyond his own lifetime, shaping debates that continue wherever societies struggle to balance liberty with order. In the final stage of Thomas Hobbes's long life, the storms that had once surrounded him began to quiet, though his ideas continued to provoke reaction across Europe. By now, he was an old man who had outlived most of his contemporaries, a rare witness to nearly an entire century of upheaval. Born under the shadow of foreign invasion and matured during civil war, he had spent his life thinking about one central problem: how human beings could escape destruction at their own hands. Even as physical strength faded, his intellectual discipline remained intact. Visitors who met him in his later years described a man still sharp in conversation, deliberate in speech, and unwavering in his convictions. He never retreated from the core principles he had established decades earlier. Order, security, and peace remained the highest political goods. Without them, all other achievements of civilization, art, science, trade, religion, would crumble into chaos. Hobbes understood that many saw his philosophy as bleak. To describe life without government as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short was not comforting. Yet he believed honesty required acknowledging humanity's vulnerability. His critics often accused him of having too little faith in human goodness. He would have responded that he placed faith not in idealized virtue, but in rational self-interest. Human beings seek survival and stability. That shared desire makes political cooperation possible. The social contract is not born from love or moral perfection, but from the rational fear of mutual destruction. In these final reflections, Hobbes's work revealed a deeper consistency. He had begun with motion and matter, constructing a universe governed by mechanical laws. From there, he examined human sensation, thought, and desire as physical processes. Finally, he built political society as an artificial structure designed to regulate those processes. The Leviathan, symbolized as a giant sovereign composed of countless individuals, represented collective power created to prevent collapse. It was not divine, not sacred, but necessary. As Europe moved gradually toward Enlightenment thinking, Hobbes's influence became more complex. Some philosophers rejected his defense of absolute sovereignty, yet adopted his method of grounding politics in human nature rather than divine right. Others used his social contract theory as a foundation, while reshaping it toward liberty rather than authority. Even those who opposed him depended on the framework he introduced. He shifted political philosophy from medieval theology towards secular analysis. Government was no longer explained primarily through scripture, but through psychology and reason. His materialism also left a lasting mark. By describing human beings as entirely physical, he challenged centuries of dualistic thought separating body and soul. Though later thinkers would soften or modify his conclusions, the boldness of his claim forced philosophy to reconsider the relationship between mind and matter. Modern discussions of consciousness, freedom, and scientific explanation still echo with questions he raised. Thomas Hobbes died in 1679 at the age of 91, reportedly after a brief illness. According to tradition, his final words reflected characteristic wit, describing death as a great leap in the dark. Whether exact or not, the phrase captures something essential about him. He had spent his life analyzing uncertainty, fear, and the unknown. Yet he approached even mortality with rational acceptance. He was buried quietly, without grand ceremony. But the ideas he left behind refused to remain quiet. In the centuries that followed, revolutions, constitutions, and philosophical movements would wrestle with his legacy. Whenever societies debate how much power a government should possess, whenever citizens weigh security against liberty, whenever fear of disorder shapes political choice, the shadow of Hobbes appears. His philosophy does not promise comfort. It does not idealize human nature or celebrate spontaneous harmony. Instead, it insists that peace requires structure, that freedom without authority risks collapse, and that civilization is a fragile achievement built upon mutual agreement. For some, this realism feels harsh. For others, it feels necessary. Thomas Hobbes remains one of the most uncompromising voices in political thought. He stared directly at the possibility of chaos and asked what must be built to prevent it. By doing so, he forced humanity to confront a difficult truth. Order is not automatic. Morality is not self-enforcing. And peace must be constructed deliberately. In that stark clarity lies his enduring power, a reminder that beneath the surface of every stable society rests a careful balance between fear and reason, authority and survival.